So, good morning, everyone. I know we are all very excited, but let us try to keep a bit of silence for me to be able to introduce Terence and immediately give the floor to him. Terence Kalin. As you well know, Terence Killeen is a research scholar at the James Joyce Center in Dublin. He's the author of Ulysses Unbound, a reader's companion to Ulysses, which has remained in continuous publication since it was first published in 2004. It has recently been reissued by the University Press of Florida. He has also made a significant contribution to our knowledge of the origins of Ulysses by extensive work and revelations on the figure of Alfred Hunter, the Dublin man who provided the inspiration for Leopold Bloom. He has published widely on many aspects of Joyce studies, including the essay Fundamental Sounds in Finnegan's Wake in the collection A Kaleidorscape of Joyce, fetched script for Fritz Schoen. His most recent publication is Tracing the Curve of an Emotion, Joyce's early portrait essay in the collection Joyce's Nonfiction Writings, edited by Catherine Ibery and James Fraser. He has been a long-time Finnegan's Wake seminar leader and lecturer at both the Dublin and Trieste Joyce summer schools. He's also a journalist who reports and comments regularly on Joyce matters in the Irish Times, etc., etc. Needless to say, we are all delighted that Terence accepted our invitation to come to Mexico and to be one of the keynote speakers for this symposium. So, without any further ado, I will only read the title of his lecture today, which is, you have it here, The Border Incident Pre-Repeated Itself, a Study in Conflict. Terence.
Thank you, Aurora, very much. How could I not say yes to an invitation like that? And of course I did. I was delighted to get it, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It really is. I'm very pleased. Okay, let's get used to this. Yeah, my slides are by no means perfection in technical terms, but I hope that they're clear at least. The border incident pre-repeated itself. There's the page number and the line number. And that short sentence, and it is a sentence since it has a subject and a predicate very, very clearly. As I say, page 81, line 33 of Finnegan's Wake. This is a worse slide again, or will be if it ever comes up. It didn't work at all. And that's it there embedded in the text, but you can see it's gone crazy. But anyway, the underlined bit is where it appears actually on the page in the standard Faber edition, standard Faber Finnegan's Wake. So, but that sentence did not spring fully formed from Joyce's head at that point. As I say, it was inserted quite late into the text, probably it appeared first in the galley proofs for Faber in probably early 1938, not long before the book's publication, 1939. So it's a very late insert, actually, into a much earlier body of text, which is one reason why it's interesting. What do I have next? Nothing. There it is. I hope you can see that at the very last line. The border incident pre-repeated. Can people see that or not? Yeah, more or less, anyway. Yeah. It's the very last line of that on that slide. That's Joyce's hand, marking with B where it's to go into the text. So he added it. Those are the Faber galley proofs. He added it at that point. How am I doing for sound? Am I audible? Okay. Okay. No, I prefer not to. No, prefer not. Thanks. Oh, that's what there's a problem. Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. So there's method to that. Okay, I see. Yeah, I will take it actually. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Right. I can be heard when I turn my head now, I hope. And that's better. That's a lot better. So there, as I was saying, trying to say, is the last sentence, is that sentence at the bottom of that Galley proof, 1937, and you can see the James Joyce archive number there as well at the bottom. So it did not spring fully formed from Joyce's head, as I was saying, there and then in that form. That's not its first sort of manifestation. And these compositions really did spring fully formed from Joyce's head. Prior to this insert here, prior to this, but not long before at all, it was entered into notebook 6B46, which is dated from a little earlier, sort of probably late 37 to February 38, in the following form. You probably won't be able to see it there. The second last line on the left, you can just about see maybe a border incident. And the James Joyce archive does a sort of an orange-green filter on some of those pages. So the column on the right actually has the phrase without the crossing out. So it's possibly clearer on the right, where it says a border incident. So already it's saying a border incident. It's not saying, it's already there in that form, but the rest of the sentence has yet to formulate itself, but it's there in that form. And you can see that it reads there, a border incident, not the border incident as it becomes later on. Before that again though, and we're receding all the time here, it appeared in an earlier notebook, notebook 6B44, somewhat earlier, under the form. Can you see, it's the last entry there, where it says a border incident. I hope some people can see that at least. It actually has down there a border incident. At that point, it's border, not border. It's B-O-R-D-E-R, not B-O-A-R-D-E-R. So that, when Joyce, it's crossed out as you can see, and when he transferred it from that notebook to notebook 6B46 and then into the Galley proof, he changed, at that point, he changed it from a border incident to a border incident. He put in the A, changing the word substantially from border, B-O-R-D-E-R, to border, B-O-A-R-D-E-R. So in that alteration, and I'll leave to hear no more slides for a little while now. In that alteration, you can see already, I think, Joyce's creative process at work, his creativity at work. The phrase, a border incident, B-O-R-D, is a very standard one, banal, possibly culled from a newspaper account of some incident at some border, though I don't think a source has actually been found for the phrase in those notebooks yet. Anyway, there was plenty of incidents around in 1936, 37 to supply material to sort of for the phrase to turn up pretty often. But in its transfer to the later notebook, an act of creative appropriation occurred from being just another of many banal phrases that Joyce transcribed in these notebooks. This one becomes, in the transition from border incident to border incident, already part of the compositional process at this stage. And before moving on to the implications of that change, as I'll do in a moment, we could generalize just a little from this example about sort of Joyce's note-taking in general. The most remarkable part of this exercise, in a way, is how this little phrase is thrown down on a notebook page with no specific place yet for its possible insertion. It might not be, in fact, inserted at all. Many of the phrases in the notebooks were never inserted. It's just put down with an eye to future use somewhere. I mean, actually, it's a bit more focused than that. He had working a particular passage at the time, but nonetheless, it was an open question where it might end up, or if it would end up anywhere at all. And that's some of the fascination, really, of the notebooks, in a way, of watching them, because you're seeing a kind of process at work with the artist, if you like, exploring different possibilities, rejecting some. These are called textual units, and there's a good reason, and unit is a good term for it. That they are units or little seeds from which something much bigger might grow, to vary the metaphor a bit. So a unit could become a multiplicity of units eventually, and they did, in fact, they did. This is the kind of nitty-gritty compositional phase that Joyce was going through at the time. Anyway, enough of that. Taking then this crossed-out phrase, a border incident, Joyce made of it on the galley proof the sentence already cited, which you may well have all forgotten by now, but it read, more back. Maybe not. Yeah, it read, that's the sentence we've got. Yeah. All right, okay, fine. So it becomes then that phrase. The most striking extra ingredient now, of course, is pre-repeated, which is not in the notebook. Pre-repeated as a word is highly appropriate for this work. Everything in it is pre-repeated, already repetition from the non-beginning. It's repeated itself before it's even happened. And the little word border, B-O-A-R-D-E-R, also contains a great deal. As it stands, it hints at encroachment, at attack. The second definition of the word in the OED actually is to do with encroachment and attack. A person who forces their way onto a ship in an attack. We may remember that prepare to repel borders is a pretty common cry in many a pirate saga. You often get that. So that's the kind of border we're talking about here. People who encroach, who attack, who invade. That's what border is doing there. The primary meaning of border, of course, though, is not that. The primary meaning is someone who receives accommodation and food in return for payment, as in the boarding house, obviously. The story, is the Dubliner story. And that meaning is also operative in Joyce's use here, as we shall see. So, but behind the phrase, the border incident, it's impossible, as I've said, not to hear back there the well-known newspaper references to border incident. And as shown, that was Joyce's first inscription, was a border incident before he turned it into a border incident. So a border incident usually refers to some kind of clash between a country's external border guards and would-be border crossers or intruders. And it is clear what we see on the page derives from that primary meaning in all likelihood. Almost all wake phrases require this kind of interpretive reshuffling of what you actually see in front of your eyes. You have to kind of hear something behind what you see to get the full measure of what is actually there. To use Joyce's own example, and I have to go forward now a little. Yeah, that was Joyce's example himself in the letter to Harriet Weaver. Half a glance of Irish frisky. You're meant to hear, though not see, half a glass of Irish whiskey. Does it work? I don't know. The example that Joyce himself gives, any of the kind of multiple reading interpretations that one is engaged in while wading through the text. Okay. In fact, the two phrases, border incident and border incident, are incredibly congruent. A border incident is almost invariably a border incident, or is seen as such. Someone is seen as encroaching on another country's border, as boarding or invading the territory the border is meant to define and defend. Given that this short sentence, very short by Finnegan's Wake standards, was inserted so late in the work, it does look as if it is meant to be explanatory in nature in some way, to describe, perhaps, unlikely though it seems, what's going on in the context around it, what is happening in those pages. And it could be even called, in a sense, a summary of what has been going on. It's been about this in many ways. Because what has been going on is indeed about incursion and defense, about contestations and disputes. Incident slightly understates it. And in fact, the word incident is itself a euphemism, as we probably well know. Border incidents, as newspapers and official spokespersons tend to call them, are often very violent. Examples abound. They're rarely pacific matters of just turning someone away. There's frequently a clash involved. And these early chapters of Finnegan's Wake are much concerned with conflict and contestation. Excuse me. Following the initial encounter in the Phoenix Park in Part 1, Chapter 2, Chapters 3 and 4 largely reenact this encounter with a greater degree of violence involved each time. The point at which this sentence, the border incident pre-repeated itself, appears has been the moment of greatest physical threat and indeed physical force. The sources of some of this material are strange, but characteristically Joycean in many ways. These chapters, Part 1, Chapters 2, 3, and 4, contain some of the very earliest writing in Finnegan's wake. The late arrival of our core sentence is an exception. It's a late flourish in material that actually is a good deal earlier, written much, much further back. The composition began with a draft of what became Chapter 2 in August 1923, and in the autumn and winter of 23-24, Joyce drafted the rest of Chapter 2 and what became Chapters 3 and 4. At this stage, he was relying extensively on Irish newspapers for material, and this works its way into the various contentions outlined in these chapters. For instance, the passage in which our core sentence is embedded is partially derived from the following report in the Connacht Tribune. Yeah. Oh, died. Get it back. Yeah, it's one back. Yeah. Fierce struggle, man with mask and iron bar, wooden revolver. The burglar then went to the door and Byrne caught hold of a long bar he had and with which he broke in the door. Connacht Tribune, I have the date and stuff there. And this is the original report, just for fun. I put that in. That's the actual Connacht Tribune report. Just, you can't read it, of course, but just to show that it's real. Anyway, Joyce's note derived from this reads, that's notebook 6B11, caught hold of a long bar he had with which he broke in door. You can see, I hope, that note derives directly from the newspaper report. And this becomes then in the text. Yeah, catching Holst of an oblong bar he had and with which he usually broke furniture. So Joyce has done a bit of playing around with this, obviously, and taken it quite a few stages further, but the core remains that Connacht Tribune, that humble Connacht Tribune report from way, way back. And that's not the only use to which this newspaper report is put. Via extensive notes taken by Joyce in the contemporaneous notebook 6B11. Further on in the account of this intrusion, we are told, oh yeah, damn it, lost it again. I've gone too far. Yeah, sorry. Need to reboot this. Okay. We are told Byrne succeeded in taking the bar, and a wooden affair in the shape of a revolver fell from the intruder, who then became friendly and wanted to know if Byrne had the change of a £10 note, and if so, that he, the burglar, would give him back the £6.10 taken from him, 10 shillings taken from last summer. Byrne said he had no money, and the burglar then left. This passage gets into Joyce's work in multiple ways in this part, Joyce's text around here, and indeed one can see why. Here we go again. Now, a Woden affair in the shape of a Webley being, of course, a well-known mark of revolver, fell from the intruder, who whereupon became friendly, and to know wanted if his strange companion happened to have the loose change of a £10 crickler, a £10 note, about him at the moment, adding that hapso he would pay him back the 6 Vicks odd, Vic being Victoria, 6 sovereigns odd. Do you see out of that what was taken on the man of samples last Uni or July? Do you follow me, Captain? To this the other rather amusedly replied, woo, woo, would you be grossly surprised, Hill, to learn that, as it so happens, I honestly have not such a thing as the least chance of a tin pan crackler anywhere about me at the present moment. The main point to be made about all this is how closely it sticks to the humble newspaper account again that it derives from, even down to the amount, the £6 10 shillings, which becomes, of course, the 6 Vicks odd of the wake text, Vicks being Victoria with the monarch's face. Similarly, just another one, on page 63, line 7, there's an account of another incident where one of the principal weapons involved is a fender. In this American context here, I should possibly just say that a fender is not the mudguard of a vehicle, protective mudguard, fender, bender, and still less is it an electric guitar. It's not that either. It's actually a frame, a low frame surrounding a fireplace to prevent burning coals from falling out onto the floor. So the fender mentioned here comes from, this report in the Freeman's Journal of November the 1st, 23. The explanation, novel way of opening a bottle of stout. Richard Whiteley, Patrick Farrell, and William Hannon were found guilty at the commission, charged with having, at an early hour of the morning of Sunday, October 7, attempted to break into Pickford's store, 6 Upper Sheriff Street, with intent to steal goods. It was stated by P.C. Sutton that he and another constable saw the 3 prisoners at the gate of the store. Hannon was pushing the gate with his shoulder, and the others were standing by. When they saw witness, they moved to a dark doorway. Whiteley was carrying a fender. When witness asked where he got the fender, one of the men said, "That is for you to find out." Yes, a keen answer. Whiteley, speaking from the dock, said they were only trying to open a bottle of stout by hammering it against the gate. Once again, just for the fun, that's the original report in the Freeman's Journal. Again, you can't read it, but that's where it was. Okay, where have I gone? There's a great deal more in that vein, and indeed extracts from this case, which are quite hilarious, weave their way again via extensive notes in notebook 6B11 throughout this passage on pages 62-63. More than that, it supplies a great deal of the basis of these pages. The echoes are more than verbal, they're actually structural and indeed narrative as well. Thus, the Freeman's Journal report also includes the following exchanges. No? Yeah, that's it. It begins the same way. The Lord Chief Justice of Police witness, "I suppose you know how to draw the cork out of a bottle of stout." A laugh, not surprisingly. "Yes," replied the witness. The Lord Chief Justice, "Was the sound you heard like trying to get the cork out of a bottle?" Witness, "Nothing like it." Laughter. And that becomes the battering babel all over the door and signposts, he always said, was not in the very remotest like the belsy babble of a bottle of booze, which would not rouse him out of slumber deep. So it's a direct echo, really. And here's a final instance, and I want to move on from these fun and games now after this. But one more. Oh, no. We'll get it, though. Yeah, that's it. Next one. That's it. No. That's it, yeah. Morris Behan, caretaker of the stores, said that he was in bed and heard heavy hammering at the gate. Same report. That becomes the Boots About the Swan, that's the name of the pub in this case here. Morris Behan said, "Were prized safe in bed by hearing hammering on the pantywank scale emanating from the blind pig, and anything like it, una, in the whole history of the mudding can, he never. So I suppose the most remarkable feature here is indeed the preservation of the name of Maurice Behan from the newspaper report into the text of Finnegan's Wake, and it seems very likely to assume that no one would have been more surprised by his improbable apotheosis in the pages of Finnegan's Wake than Maurice Behan himself, if he ever knew it. The same is true of the real person, Festi King, later on in the King trial, again from the Connaught Tribune, steps from the pages of that paper into the Chapter 4, Part 1, Chapter 4 as well. I hasten to add that the discovery of these items was made inevitably by Vincentine. Almost everything along this line was. And it must have been quite a moment to find Fender and Maurice Behan and so on confirm, that the notebooks which Vincent was working from had these sources and came from there. Okay. And the other important remark to make is that while Finnegan's Wake may indeed appear and be fairly weird, it's not much weirder than some of its source material, as you can see there. This report with the Fender, the bottle of stout, the question of whether the store caretaker would have been woken by the sound of someone trying to open a bottle of stout or not in the normal way, not to mention the unusual way of opening the bottle, is already of its nature a perfect candidate for inclusion in Finnegan's Wake, and indeed it gets in. And there's much more than verbal echoes, as I say. These two court cases provide much of the narrative material of Part 1, Chapter 3, and the Festi King. I think I've been saying Chapter 4, I should have said Chapter 3 most of the time there. And the Festi King case, which is in Chapter 4, though treated more elaborately and widely, again has this kind of newspaper report basis. Okay, the main point here, however, is the very democratic nature of these sources. They could hardly be more so. These are conflicts, but they are highly localized, far from earth-shattering in their implications. At no stage are more than two direct antagonists suggested. That does not matter, however. Again and again we are told that these contestations are a figure for all contests, for all battles. They all ultimately reduce to this, or conversely, these encounters are just as meaningful, as the great world historical ones. Just after the sentence which began this paper here, we find the pair, whether they were Napoleono engaging whaling Tau, or Daraskius trying to reconnoitre the General Bukalev, man may not say, struggled apparently for some considerable time, the cradle rocking equally to one and oppositely from the other on its law of capture and recapture. So the antagonists could just as easily be Wellington and Napoleon as the West Galway burglar and the house dweller, from which the story, that particular story, derives. As we have seen, in the subspecie aeternitatis perspective of this book, all conflicts are the same. The situation is most neatly summarized by the statement on page 78, lines 29-31. Each, of course, on the purely defensive, since the Eternals were otherwise on their side every time. The statement clearly is heavily ironic. The Eternals cannot be on each side at the same time, but they are. And each side believes they are, of course, more to the point. And defensive combines defensive and offensive in a very neat, compressed way. It's both. It's offensive and defensive simultaneously, with great economy. The contradiction between a reality and a subjective belief, purely offensive, suggesting particularly, that it's entirely self-exculpation in advance. Some of the suggested contestants mentioned are very pointed. On the same page we find the two sides in New South Ireland and Vetera Ulla, Blooming and Pill faces, during the ferment with the Pope or on the Pope. I mean, that's pretty pointed politically as to this is a conflict on the island of Ireland. New South Ireland being the newly minted Irish Free State, and Vetera Ulla being Old Ulster, which remained, attached to the Ancien regime, one might say. Blooming and Pill faces suggests a racist element. And with the Pope and on the Pope hardly needs glossing, since the two sides concerned are pretty clear, the Northern Ireland religious divide essentially being there, and the capitalization suggesting sloganeering, of course. So throughout this early part of the book, we are plunged into a world of conflict in many respects. As early as the first line of the second page, where the reader has been given a tourist's guide to Dublin, we are told, what clashes here of wills gen won'ts, oystery gods, gaggin, fishy gods. Indeed, the whole history of the relations between the Southern Irish state and the Northern Ireland political entity could be summed up in this slogan, wills gen won'ts. I will, you won't. I will, you won't. It almost crystallizes it, if you want. And with the unfortunate Northern Catholic minority as the piggy in the middle of all that. And each side equally convinced of the justice of its cause. It may be matter that in Derrida's only significant commentary on Finnegan's Wake, his most substantial contribution was actually about Ulysses Gramophone, but he did talk about Finnegan's Wake at one point, and he seized, as was his wont, on a particular phrase, which I have. This is a long time ago, and it just shows how old I am that I'm back in deconstructionist stuff. Total old hat, but anyway. He seized on the phrase anti-war, and he played around with that an awful lot, but he absolutely held on to the suggestion of war, conflict, battle, much further out in the book, but you can see it's still operative there. So this absolute equivalence that the book seems to posit between the sides, any side, in any possible conflict, does raise something of a problem for a reader. Joyce apparently told Harriet Weaver early on in his conception of the book that it was to be a universal history, and anyone who goes very far into the book, let alone the commentary around it, will be aware of its universalizing ambitions. It's an attempt, on one level, to write a general theory of universal history. Its apothegms, its prescriptions are meant to have a universal bearing, and sometimes you get things that look like they're proverbs if you could only understand what the proverb was about, or what the particular nugget of wisdom that you were getting was. I won't even read it out because it's meant to be kind of proverbial in some way. So true is it, well, I will read it out. So true is it that there where's a turnover, the tea is wet too. I don't know how true that is. One would like to know. You know, it may have a bearing and a point somewhere or other, and turnover and tea actually do go together, turnover being actually a loaf of bread. And when you think you catch sight of a hind, make sure but you're cocked by a hen. Again, it's friendly advice, if only you knew what I was telling you to do. That's the only trouble. So in some way, it's meant to have a generalized application, to be a piece of advice to the reader, as I said, or at least a parody of such. So viewed as the book does, sub specie eternitatis, it may well be that all conflicts are indeed morally equivalent. Relevant here is Richard Ellman's report of a conversation between Joyce and Samuel Beckett about the impending Second World War. Beckett, he says, could see that it might have a reason. Joyce could see none. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to put up, actually. Yeah, it is, yeah. What was worse, Ellman says, it was distracting the world from reading Finnegan's Wake, in which the unimportance of wars in the total cycle of human activity was made perfectly clear. This is Ellmanian irony. I don't know whether it derives from Beckett himself or not, or whether Ellman is extrapolating as he was capable of doing a little and gilding the lily slightly, but it could be that Joyce did make a remark along those lines to Beckett, which Beckett would then have passed on to Ellman. It's certainly possible. And if not, well, Ellman thinks it's worth putting in anyway. So, and that snippet anyway supports what I've been saying about the attitude to conflict in the book. And it's symptomatic of this, in this connection, that commentators, almost all commentators, in fact all commentators I think, have great difficulty in determining who the antagonists are in these multiple conflicts in these early chapters. In the initial account in part 1, chapter 2, it's clear that one of the figures involved is the book's hero, HCE. I've got by so far without even naming the guy, but I had to do it sometime, and that's it, HCE. And the other is apparently a younger man called the Cad, or sometimes Gil. But as the incident is told and retold throughout chapters 3 and 4, it becomes harder and harder to figure out who is actually who on either side. And it's a real problem. You can even see Bill Cadbury analyzing the textual genesis of those two chapters, 3 and 4, and 2, 3, and 4, I think, actually having great trouble trying to decipher. He goes back to the newspaper report and tries to see who had the oblong bar and who didn't have the iron bar, that kind of stuff, to try and figure out. And the same applies actually to Adeline Lachine and to almost all more or less all commentators. So one must conclude that this difficulty is quite deliberate, in fact, and we're not meant to be able to tell them apart properly. Such a policy would be in accordance with the utter equivalence that Joyce seems to want to accord to these and any antagonists in any given conflict. So, to return to our opening sentence for almost the last time, I think what it is ultimately saying is that this border conflict, as it calls it, is just the same old, same old. And that's what it's telling us, I think. It's worse, it's pre-repeating itself, it's recycling itself, the same and new. Pre-repeated implies that the repetition is pre-inscribed, built into the incident even before it happened. The repetition is part of its actual origin, if you like. But for us here now, especially I think for us here now, the grounds of this Olympian indifference can be not so apparent. Is there never a conflict where one side has more power than the other, indeed where one power has all the force and the other has essentially none? The other is not a power at all, where one antagonist is powerless and the other possesses virtually it all. Where one side is clearly the aggressor and the other the invaded. And in every border incident, are both sides the custodians of the border, the country's external border, and those who seek to transgress that limit, always in the identical moral and material position? If there's an issue there, this is not the way that Finnegan's Wake approaches it. Not to say it's not conscious of this in a sense, but that's not the way it views conflict. And I think it's a valid question to ask the book. If you can ask a book a question, I think you probably can, because it does claim to be universalizing in some way, to be telling us something very general about human activity and history and all. Now, part 2, which won't take so long. Luckily, there is another cant to the question. In other words, there's another angle to the whole issue that one can take, which yields somewhat different results. And that is if we change the terms and substitute for conflict, persecution, change conflict to persecution, and a different picture emerges, I think. If we look at some of what goes on in the book through that perspective, a less Jupiterian attitude emerges. We are acquainted with Bloom's treatment by the citizen in Cyclops. Despite the many multiple qualifications now brought to bear on that encounter, it remains an instance of persecution in action, especially given the passive-aggressive support of most of the other pub occupants that they offered to Bloom's attacker. He is really almost isolated, with a couple of people semi-neutral, but certainly being persecuted. And there's at least one instance where something similar, with of course massive differences, occurs in the early part of Finnegan's Wake. This brings me to something you've probably all forgotten about, and I wouldn't at all blame you, the other meaning of the word border. A person was given food and accommodation on a regular basis in return for a payment. This meaning is also relevant to the Wake, because HCE, the principal figure in the book, does, towards the end of part 1, chapter 3, undergo a verbal and would-be physical attack, perhaps, from a figure who is a visitor to Dublin and who is a boarder in the other sense. He's digging is the key word there. He's actually boarding at a hotel or a pub in Dublin, in the premises in Leixlip, though in an earlier draft he seems to have been staying in HCE's own hotel. The The source of this visitor's anger with HCE is far from clear. It may be something to do with trouble, with his damage to his coat. But more to the point is the intensity of his fury with HCE. There's no question here as to who is the aggressor and who's the victim. I think because HCE does not get into a conflict mode, he gets into a kind of a suffering mode instead. So the terms change somewhat as a result. HCE, in the course of this attack, sits it out, uncomplaining, refusing to retaliate, anarchistically respectful of the, of the liberties of the non-invasive individual. So a different approach, if you like. And most importantly, maybe, there's an explicit allusion to Odysseus' encounter with Polyphemus in the Odyssey, which can't help but be seen as referring, of course, back to Cyclops. There are various figures suggested for this encounter as to who's attacking whom and who's engaging with whom, and one of them is nobody at all with Holy Famous, which I think we can all get that, yeah? Odysseus, Utis, no name, with Polyphemus, here turned into Holy Famous. So that's one definite kind of harking back to an earlier mode of Joyce's art. So, and it shows too a disequilibrium between the two sides, even if, ironically, the reference actually comes from HCE's assailant himself. So with that allusion in the background, the sense of persecution is inescapable, despite the many comic trappings. So this is one instance where the law of wills gen won'ts, of a parity of disesteem, does not seem to hold. It may be relevant. This episode forms the climax of part 1, chapter 3, and maybe Joyce wanted to end with a special flourish, something a bit different from the fruitless antagonisms that had peppered the text prior to that. Many other instances of persecution are in the book. No, obviously the treatment of Shem in part 1, chapter 7, which, beginning as an impersonal indictment, ends up as a personal charge sheet in which Shem is made to stand forth and receive the verdict of his intensely hostile interlocutor. The dice, however, are too heavily weighed against Shem, I think. The outcome perhaps too predictable for it to be a completely satisfactory example of the persecutory impulse I've mentioned. It's so obviously ironic that it doesn't fully work and you don't really think of Shem as a miserable outcast. It's a little loaded in the way it's presented. More germane to this quest is a passage on pages 61 to 62, which is emblematic of much of the book's approach to persecution and rejection in all its senses. The passage, alas, is something of a textual mess, and this is not the point, the time, or the place to go into that. I've done so elsewhere. Needless to say, Danis Rose has solved the conundrum, but by methods that whose validity remains to be determined as to whether they're justifiable or not. So what you get in it anyway, leaving all that aside, what you get in it anyway is this. I've excised extensively. Not everyone will consider that a valid thing to do, but I've tried to get to a core here, if you like, and that's for the reason why I've done this. The seventh city, his citadere of refuge, whither the Hegirite had fled, murmured. That's the main verb, murmured, in the sense of complained. Would rise against him, another mainish verb, with all which in them were, do him hurt, poor jink, as where he made a curse for them, the common or Erin garden castaway, in red resurrection, to condemn so they might convince him of their proper sins. The persecutory element, I think, is very clear there, really, as to what's going on. HCE has been a visitor, has come to Ireland, sometimes depicted as an invader, sometimes just as someone who arrives. And here, the place which he has made his home, turns against him. And this happens later on in the text a lot too, and wants to exile him again, at best, perhaps worse, condemn him anyway. Dublin, of course, is the seventh city of Christendom, as we know from a portrait, so it's quite clear. And HC has taken refuge after a Hegira. These are all pretty clear, interesting religious references, and there are quite a number, actually, hanging around all of this. and threatened him, etc. So the idea of HCE as pharmakos or scapegoat is, of course, quite prevalent in the book. This is an unusually direct expression of it, but it is here that one may perhaps locate the work's moral center, if it has any. This extremely slippery figure, HCE, identifiable only by 3 initials, does appear to carry the sins of the world and is duly punished for it. The book narrates his fall, and being, of course, a universal chronicle, it also narrates, from its Olympian perspective, his rise. But the reality of his persecution is not elided. This point is made as long ago as the very first monograph on the book by Campbell and Robinson, HCE as scapegoat, but it's worth leaning on it a little more in the current context. He had to come to the city from afar, an immigrant. He became established in the city. He married a local woman. He had 3 children. At some stage, the city turned on him. The end of part 2, chapter 3, just to show I read a bit further than page 80, I was leaping out further into the book just to indicate I didn't stop at page 80, though it may look like that, enacts a very similar undoing. Campbell and Robinson idealistically made much of the well-known speech of justification by HCE towards the end of part 2, chapter 3. That one that begins guilty but fellows culpos, meaning, both felix culpa and we are all equally culpable. We're all culpable together, guilty but altogether culpable. Excuse me, I lost my mic there. This is his ultimate self-exoneration, but in fact it's followed at the end of the chapter by a commentary which seems to enact his ritual hanging. Slip on your rope and collar and draw the nosebag on your head, and similarly, isn't it great he's swaying above us for his good and ours? Fly your balloons, Danny's and Dennis's, his doorknob's dead. This is the outcome of the judgment of the citizenry on the mitre builder who came to live among them. And at the end of the chapter, as we know, HCE is left alone in the pub, slumped over a chair amid the glasses and the overturned stools. Hardly an apotheosis, but rather the outcome of a sustained campaign of persecution, which, despite its many comic trappings, testifies to a serious intolerance and even xenophobia. You can't impose on free shouters like us. Free shouters being free staters, us, the Irish, in other words. Which, in a more general way, John Gordon, it's a great pleasure that he's here, it's really, really great, is right, I think, is correct in his overall reading of the saga of this strange figure who's best known by his initials. In his 7-stage plotting of the fate of HCE, which I find very convincing, John, in his book Finnegan's Wake, A Plot Summary, outlines a tale of almost unremitting catastrophe from the hero's beginning as a young invader, or immigrant perhaps, to his decline and fall as a Zulus patriarch, and Noah abandoned even by the animals of his ark. And public obloquy certainly forms part of that condition. In conclusion, I would like just to return to the sentence with which we began. I won't try, given my fortunes with these slides, to go back to it. I hope it's in your heads. The border incident pre-repeated itself. I'm not going to even attempt to put it up there again. Or did I? No, I didn't. But instead of looking at it now in terms of context, I want to take it in a different, less thematic angle. Most striking about it is the concision, the economy with which so much is packed into a little short sentence. It's really quite a compression. There are 3 distinct ideas there. Border incident in the sense of episode with a would-be border or transgressor of borders, and border incident in the sense of someone who's boarding in a particular house. So that little nugget contains that much, and that's just one mini sentence in a massively long book. So this degree of compression confirms one's sense that Finnegan's Wake suffers not from a deficit of meaning, but from a surplus of it, an excess of meaning. And at least one reason why it is written the way it is that if it were done in any more straightforward way, it would be endlessly long. And whenever Joyce did comment on it, his commentaries tended to go on forever also, so that may indicate as much. So that not only our little phrase, but indeed the whole book in it is a massive compression, with everything ultimately circling around a central but probably unreachable core. In this connection, and I hope it's not at a wild remove from our ostensible topic, I recall once attending a lecture by a cosmic physicist, not a very wise thing to do since it's almost over my head nearly, but I do remember him saying, if I remember it rightly, something like this, he said, we can at least say that, this is his last remark, that the universe is a singularity. So I was sufficiently struck by this eventually to look up what he meant by singularity in this context, which is not the normal sense of the word, of course. And I'll share what it's supposed to mean without claiming to fully understand what it's saying. Well, it's the last slide, so there we are. A point at which a function takes an infinite value, especially in space-time when matter is infinitely dense, such as the center of a black hole. Infinitely dense and black hole, many a weary reader of Finnegan's Wake has probably used these terms after a stretch of reading it. So in this respect, sheer density, Finnegan's Wake probably has no rival in literature. So it is indeed, in its own terms, a singularity, and proud of it. And thank you all very much.
Questions?
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Sorry?
Here.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask if you had anything to say, as I remember, definitely in chapter 3 and 4, and kind of in chapter 2 also, each of these conflicts ends with a sort of reconciliation. And
Right.
and as I read them, it's almost, I mean, when you're talking about, you can't tell who's who.
Yeah.
And at the end of the conflict, all the insults at the end of chapter 3, there's this
Yes.
resolution, there's this coming to terms, and they kind of wander off into the sunset together. Is how I kind of read it, and it's like you can't. It's like they merge into one.
Right.
In chapter 4, it comes to that comic resolution, you know, from I was really happy to hear the burglar story. I mean,
Yeah.
and quite amazed to hear that. Oh yeah, that really happened.
Yeah.
And they both go their separate ways, but But again, you're not sure who's who. They seem to have become the
Yeah.
identical person. Each has a fender, you know, and one is behind. But anyway, comment on reconciliation in respect to these conflicts?
Yeah, what strikes me really is that the actual conflict is far more pronounced than the reconciliation. It is true that they kind of peter out eventually. Nobody appears to be killed ultimately, though it gets close enough at times. I mean, like the newspaper report where the fellow just goes away, I was going to say your man, where your man just goes away eventually, having offered the loose change and that. You know, it does peter out, but the level of hostility there is actually very considerable. And while I take your point that, you know, it doesn't kind of come to blows normally, there's a lot of, don't you remember, do you, I'd blow the bloody bugger's head off him if I could with BL ... and all that sort of stuff. So I just think that the conflict element is more pronounced than the reconciliation one at that stage.
Terence, I have the conch here, and beside him, I haven't really formulated this as a question, but thanks for a terrific paper. I'm struck by the fact that a border incident, as you well know, that in the sense of boarding house, that is repeated in Finnegan's Wake, is Duncan in Macbeth. And I won't ask you to go back, but the slides that you're showing in relation to...
Don't ask me back, no.
Yeah, the guys banging on Sheriff Street outside the house, which would be the banging on the door in the porter scene. and the porter compares it to Hell's Gate. And you had a line there, the Beelzy babble of booze. So this incident at one and the same time is the discovery of the dead king, the fall of Parnell, and these guys on Sheriff Street claiming to open a bottle of porter.
I see where you're coming from, and it's another interesting perspective, which just confirms what I was saying about how Finnegan's Wake, covers so much. So why not Macbeth? Absolutely, yeah.
Other question? No?
Thank you, Terence, for that wonderful presentation. I'm struck by I'm very pleased, we at the conference are very pleased that you chose this particular sentence because of the Joyce Without Borders theme, of course. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way in which Joyce uses words that mean somehow the opposite of themselves. You mentioned offensive, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
And is it possible here that border is playing the same role as a word that means the opposite of itself, in that first we have the sense of a border being something that separates, and at the same time we have the sense of a border that passes from one ship in the night to another, that gains access and establishes communication with, enters into the other side. And so the very notion of boundary is paradoxically deconstructed, right, with that one word. And just one other thought to throw out there is whether you think there might be any, and this is a little bit of a stretch, but do you think there might be any relationship between the border incident here and the border incident in Ulysses, where Murphy boards Stephen in the Eumaeus episode?
Yes, that's lovely. That's a lovely little, little point. He does indeed board Stephen, and it does show the flexibility of those words and how they can be used in all sorts of senses, really. I mean, in that one, which of course is a brilliant one because of the nautical background anyway, but Murphy really accosts Stephen there. So, I mean, what it goes to show is how slippery words are, if nothing else, and certainly a boarder doesn't have to be aggressive necessarily. You can just board something in a ship that crosses in the night, as you say. I still think, though, that border here signals conflict. Just in this particular instance, I'm not saying it's true of the whole book at all, but I do think the phrase, the border incident, and I would suspect that there's some newspaper source there, but I don't know what it might be, and that the reference is to the kinds of incidents that were occurring along borders. And to take a very clear example, I suppose, the Nazis fabricated border incidents on the border with Poland. They pretend that they themselves invented these border incidents, but it was enough pretext to go and invade Poland. So something very serious is being talked about behind all the joking and the cavorting and the linguistic play.
Yes, apropos of borders and your observation, which is certainly true, that Joyce is probably telling us something when we can't tell which side is which.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a country right now, of course, which is having border incidents of a terrible sort. I live in Mexico, and one of the things that absolutely fascinates me is that every year I spend several weeks in Los Angeles, and I find myself having to speak Spanish more often in Los Angeles than I do where I live in Mexico. I mean, in other words, which side of the border am I on in these two countries? Cantinflas had a house in San Miguel, where I live, San Miguel de Allende. And he apparently once remarked, San Miguel is a wonderful place. You don't even have to know English to live there. So the border is extraordinary.
Yeah. Linguistic markers are more and more vague in those respects. And linguistic markers no longer define territorial limits at all, and that's an interesting aspect. The papers this morning at the session here actually were partly about that as well. And linguistic markers no longer, they blend into one another, which may explain some of the intensity of the desire to uphold the border. We have to keep this secure, it's our territory. You know, and I'm going to extrapolate a little bit because I wanted to say this anyway. I made a reference there to the attitude of the Southern Irish state to the Northern Ireland political entity as an example of wills, again, won'ts. And that was because, and this is not the whole story about Northern Ireland, which I cannot do now at all, but the Southern Irish state made a territorial claim to Northern Ireland in its constitution. And that reinforced an already entrenched siege mentality on the Northern Ireland side. The territorial claim was the I will, and the Northern majority said you won't, and the Southern state said you will, and the Northern said you won't, and of course they had the British to back them up. But it bedeviled the situation until it was finally removed, and the all-important principle of consent was substituted. Look, I think unless someone's really dying to say any more,